There is a shadow war currently raging beneath the surface of the mainstream news cycle, and almost no one in the media possesses the courage to talk about it. It is not the kinetic war in the skies over Tehran, and it is certainly not the naval standoff at the Strait of Hormuz. The most dangerous battle Washington is fighting today is the war for the narrative. It is the psychological battle over whether the very people being ordered to fight, bleed, and die in this Middle Eastern conflict actually believe their sacrifice means anything at all. And if we look at the raw, unfiltered data, that war is already over. Washington lost it before the first shot was even fired. Let us cut through the propaganda and be absolutely direct about the reality on the ground. The intelligence confirming this massive internal crisis is not bleeding out from foreign state media or fringe internet forums. We are talking about official American military publications. We are looking at internal Western analytical platforms and veteran journalists who maintain direct, encrypted lines of communication with active duty combat personnel and their terrified families. What these highly credible sources are documenting is a seismic institutional shift. We are witnessing a level of open, rapidly spreading dissent within the ranks that the American military has not experienced since the absolute darkest days of the Vietnam War. You have to go back to the early 1970s, an era where the complete collapse of strategic belief led to the horrifying epidemic of fragging, where over 900 documented incidents occurred of desperate soldiers literally turning fragmentation grenades on their own commanding officers. To find a historical parallel for this kind of internal psychological rot, and we must contextualize this within the Pentagon existing nightmare. The United States military is already suffering through a historic, catastrophic recruiting crisis, falling short of its targets by tens of thousands of recruits year after year. The war machine is already starved for manpower, yet within this incredibly fragile ecosystem, one specific phrase keeps echoing through leaked intelligence reports, across military social media channels, and inside the panicked text messages sent from deployed soldiers back home. The phrase is chilling in its absolute clarity. They are saying, "We do not want to die for Israel." Make no mistake, this is not the localized grumbling of a single demoralized infantry unit. This is the collective, organic realization of a massive military force that has independently concluded the war it is being ordered to fight has absolutely nothing to do with defending the homeland. These soldiers took an oath to protect the United States, but they are painfully aware that the geopolitical architects in Washington, the people making the ultimate decisions about who lives and who dies, are treating American interests as a distant afterthought. The American military apparatus operates much like a multi-trillion-dollar titanium sword. It looks invincible in a parade, but if the molecular bonds of internal belief shatter, the blade will disintegrate at the very first strike. When the legions of an empire stop believing in the emperor mission, the gates do not need to be breached by foreign enemies. The empire simply collapses under the weight of its own outsourced lies. Let us move to the narrative dimension, because it is the absolute bedrock of everything we are discussing today. Any military strategist who has spent more than a day outside a Pentagon briefing room understands a fundamental truth. The first war in any conflict is never fought with kinetic weapons. It is fought with meaning. A soldier who truly believes in the righteousness of their mission will endure unimaginable hardship, absorb terrifying levels of risk, and execute operations at a caliber that no training manual can fully quantify. But a soldier who does not understand why they are fighting, or worse, who actively suspects their commander-in-chief is lying to them, will operate at a fraction of that capacity. They will look for exits, both psychologically and physically, and eventually transform from an asset of military strength into a massive vector of institutional collapse. The United States has historically been brilliant at building military mythology. For decades, it wrapped its foreign interventions in the unassailable language of freedom, democracy, and the defense of the homeland. And even when those interventions were flawed, the mythology functioned perfectly. Think back to the post-9/11 era. The invasion of Iraq was predicated on the terrifying specter of weapons of mass destruction. We now know it was a fabricated narrative, but at the time, it was a brilliantly constructed story. It unlocked a multi-trillion-dollar war chest and secured overwhelming, almost unquestioning domestic backing. Afghanistan possessed an even stronger narrative rooted in the genuine bleeding wound of September the 11th, which drove public approval for military retaliation to a staggering 90%. Even the intervention in Libya was wrapped in a humanitarian framing. None of these justifications were entirely honest, but they gave the average soldier a coherent answer when they stared at the ceiling at night and asked themselves, "Why am I here?" This current conflict has absolutely no story. Watch the White House press briefings. The official justification is a revolving door of contradictory political buzzwords. On Monday, we are told it is about neutralizing Iranian nuclear capabilities. By Wednesday, it is about keeping the Strait of Hormuz open. By Friday, the whispers shift to regional stability and regime change. And the devastating irony, the very same officials citing the nuclear threat have publicly bragged that Iran nuclear infrastructure has already been crippled. It is a total logical paradox, and the troops are wide awake to this deception. Look at the intelligence regarding the recent deployment of roughly 4,500 Marines and naval personnel redirected toward the Persian Gulf. The internal reports do not describe ordinary troop fatigue. They use the word fury. These men and women are circulating desperate messages to their families back home, openly describing the impending operation as a meat grinder with zero defined end state. The fear paralyzing these units is not the fear of combat. It is the uniquely American nightmare of bleeding out in the sand for a cause you do not understand, orchestrated by people who do not care. They find themselves trapped on a geopolitical ghost ship, a multi-billion-dollar vessel drifting aimlessly through the dense fog of Washington political calculations, devoid of a moral compass, yet relentlessly demanding its crew to row obediently into the abyss. A modern soldier Kevlar vest might be perfectly engineered to stop a rifle round to the chest, but no military empire in human history can survive a bullet to its purpose. Now, we must examine the most dangerous asymmetry in this entire conflict. It is not an asymmetry of stealth technology, and it is not an asymmetry of missile stockpiles. It is the staggering contrast between the psychological state of the American military and the Iranian military. For Iran, this war is existential in the most literal, terrifying sense of the word. The survival of their state, the independence of their nation, and the continuation of a political and religious system that has defined their society for decades are perceived to be directly on the line. Their soldiers, their militia members, and the broader mobilized population do not need state-sponsored propaganda or fabricated mythology to understand the stakes. They only need to look across their borders at the absolute rubble of Iraq, at the fractured ruins of Libya and Syria, and at the utter devastation in Gaza to draw a definitive conclusion about what Western defeat actually means. We must remember the brutal Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, a generation-defining trauma where Iran absorbed hundreds of thousands of casualties, frequently utilizing horrific human wave tactics simply to hold the line against a foreign invasion. That deep historical trauma breeds a raw, unyielding quality of motivation that absolutely no Western military can replicate. For American forces, the reality is starkly, almost absurdly different. By the explicit admission of the soldiers themselves, this is someone else's war. The sovereign territory of the United States has not been attacked. The homeland is not threatened. Instead, this conflict visibly serves Israeli strategic objectives in ways that are painfully apparent even to those with absolutely no background in international relations. And who is actually bearing the burden of this operation? The costs are not theoretical. The aircraft losses, the base destructions, and the spiking global energy prices are hammering ordinary American households right now. Consider that staggering $100 billion funding request currently moving through Washington. That is $100 billion that will be ripped directly out of domestic social programs and infrastructure, pouring high-octane fuel onto the fire of crushing domestic inflation. The American working class is being asked to finance their own economic decline, all while the primary geopolitical beneficiary of this military campaign remains a foreign government. You cannot bridge this massive motivational gap with better Pentagon press briefings or more aggressive information operations. It reflects a genuine, irreconcilable difference in what the two sides actually have at stake. You can build the most technologically advanced fighter jets on the planet, but you cannot mass-produce the will to fight. Throughout the bloody history of warfare, the side fighting for its very existence has consistently outlasted the side fighting for abstract, outsourced objectives with no connection to the lived reality of the soldiers doing the dying. A superpower can print $100 billion to fund a war of convenience, but it cannot print the courage required to bleed for someone else's borders. Let us look at the geopolitical theater playing out on our screens, because what the administration has been doing publicly reveals a command structure that has completely lost the thread of a coherent strategy. We are witnessing real-time improvisation under the crushing pressure of reality, and the damage being done to American credibility is catastrophic. Just days ago, the president called into an Israeli television network, Channel Shasen. During that broadcast, he made statements that were genuinely staggering in both their content and their strategic recklessness. In one breath, he promised what he explicitly termed the total annihilation of Iran, a nation of nearly 90 million people. In the exact same breath, he complained bitterly that NATO has done absolutely nothing to support the American campaign. It is as if Washington treats Article W of the NATO Charter, the sacred mutual defense provision, as a casual menu suggestion rather than a binding military commitment. Let us not forget the profound historical irony here. Article W has only been invoked exactly one time in the entire history of the alliance, and it was invoked by the United States itself following the tragedy of September the 11th, demanding European blood and treasure in Afghanistan. Yet today, this administration is threatening to ignite a catastrophic regional war without consulting a single NATO ally before the threats were issued. The international community is not blind to this arrogance. Look at the immediate response. Germany, France, Italy, Spain, the core pillars of European defense, are providing absolutely zero military support. NATO, as a formal institution, has actively withdrawn its military advisors from the Middle East theater. Then came the ultimate diplomatic miscalculation, the move that stripped away the illusion of American omnipotence, the 48-hour ultimatum. It was a highly publicized demand requiring Iran to fully open the Strait of Hormuz, carrying the explicit threat that refusing it would result in the absolute destruction of Iranian energy infrastructure. Iran refused. The 48 hours passed, the strait remained closed, and the threatened destruction never materialized. The ultimatum was instantly exposed to the entire globe as a colossal bluff. Why did the strongest military on Earth back down? Because behind closed doors, military reality violently collided with political rhetoric. The Pentagon top advisors clearly had to sit the commander-in-chief down and explain basic operational physics. Destroying that sprawling fortified infrastructure within 48 hours was simply not achievable with the assets currently in the theater. Furthermore, the economic blowback would have been apocalyptic. If those Iranian energy facilities burned, Brent crude would not just rise, it would instantly spike past $150 a barrel. It would paralyze maritime trade and plunge the entire Western world into a crippling overnight recession. The quiet 5-day pause that followed the ultimatum expiration was not a calculated tactical maneuver. It was a humiliating acknowledgement of strategic impotence. The gap between what the White House says on television and what the American military can actually deliver in reality has become a glaring chasm. Geopolitics is not a reality television show where you can edit out your mistakes in post-production. It is a high-stakes poker game played with live ammunition. And right now, Washington is shoving all its chips into the center of the table with a pair of twos, oblivious to the fact that Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran can see its miserable hand reflected in its own sunglasses. A superpower does not lose its global hegemony the day it is defeated on the battlefield. It loses it the very second the world realizes its ultimatums are written in pencil. There is a broader, far more alarming dimension to this unprecedented military dissent that extends well beyond the immediate theater of operations. It connects to a profound structural tension in the American civil-military relationship, a fault line that this conflict is exposing in ways that will have devastating institutional consequences long after the shooting stops. The American military has an institutional culture built entirely around the sacred concept of civilian control. It is the foundational democratic principle that military force is strictly a tool of political authority, and that soldiers do not substitute their own political judgment for the decisions of elected civilian leadership. We only need to look back to 1951, when President Harry Truman famously relieved General Douglas MacArthur of his command during the Korean War, to understand why this principle is paramount to the survival of the Republic. It exists for good reasons, and its erosion would be unimaginably dangerous. But let us be completely uncompromisingly clear. Civilian control has never meant that military professionals are required to blindly march their forces into a strategic meat grinder just to satisfy a politician ego. It has never meant that senior officers cannot assess the physical viability of a campaign and communicate that honest, brutal assessment through appropriate, formal channels. What the current, deeply sourced reports describe is not a military coup. It is not an organized act of treason or insubordination. It is something equally terrifying. It is the expression through desperate leaks to civilian journalists and the frantic circulation of unofficial communications of a unified professional consensus. And that consensus is this: the operation currently being contemplated, specifically a full-scale ground invasion of Iran, is simply not winnable at an acceptable cost. When commissioned officers at the absolute highest levels of command are forced to privately describe a potential ground operation as an absolute disaster to the press, they are performing a historical function. They are providing an honest, reality-based assessment to counterbalance the intense political pressure toward operations that their experience guarantees will fail. But the fact that this vital, life-saving intelligence is surfacing through media leaks rather than through formal Pentagon channels tells you a dark truth about whether those formal channels are even functioning anymore. And the fact that the administration response to this kind of professional input has been to actively purge the senior officers who refuse to tell the president what he wants to hear tells you everything you need to know. We are looking at a military that has had its senior leadership deliberately decapitated under wartime conditions, explicitly punished for displaying insufficient enthusiasm about an operation they privately consider to be an unwinnable catastrophe. A military managed for domestic political optics rather than lethal capability is not a force at the peak of its institutional effectiveness. It is a hollow shell waiting to be crushed by reality, and that management style breeds consequences on the battlefield that no amount of public optimism or televised bravado can ever reverse. The Pentagon chain of command has mutated into a dangerous political echo chamber, and history guarantees us one fundamental truth: an army that is ordered to lie to itself in the briefing room will inevitably bleed for that lie in the desert. Let us close with the ultimate question that all of this inevitably leads to, because the next few days and weeks will force an answer whether Washington is ready for it or not. The Trump administration launched this conflict clinging to an arrogant set of assumptions about speed, decisiveness, and the paralyzing psychological impact of overwhelming American force. Today, every single one of those assumptions lies in ruins. We are now in the 6th week of this campaign. The strategic objectives, whatever they actually were to begin with, have not been achieved and remain a profound mystery. The military is expressing open, unprecedented dissent about the fundamental purpose and viability of the operation. The financial cost has already blasted past $100 billion. Domestic political support is split and rapidly declining. The regional coalition has completely dissolved, and the NATO alliance has explicitly not participated. And look at the broader geopolitical chessboard. While Washington burns its treasure and political capital in the desert, Russia is quietly providing critical targeting intelligence to the adversary. China is systematically supplying the advanced microelectronics and components that Iran weapons systems are built from. Beijing and Moscow are bleeding the American empire without firing a single shot. And yet, in the face of all this catastrophic failure, the administration is now actively considering a full-scale ground invasion that its own senior officers are privately describing as an absolute disaster. The war for the narrative, the war for the cohesive story that would give American soldiers a legitimate reason to fight and die, was the first and most vital war in this conflict. It was never properly planned for. The administration foolishly assumed that kinetic military action would magically generate its own justification, that tactical success would somehow create its own narrative. That assumption was fatally wrong, and without that narrative war, the military war becomes something that a democratic republic simply cannot sustain indefinitely. An astronomically expensive, deeply unpopular, undefined conflict fought by soldiers who do not know why they are there, for objectives that nobody will fully articulate, in service of foreign interests that the people being asked to die for increasingly believe are not their own. History does not have a gentle name for what happens when a military force reaches this breaking point without a political resolution in sight. But history has seen it before, from the Roman legions stretched too thin in foreign forests to the Soviets bleeding out in the valleys of Afghanistan, and the outcomes have never been favorable for the side that lost the narrative before the battlefield was even decided. We are going to keep tracking every single dimension of this unprecedented conflict: the military, the political, the psychological, and the institutional. Right here on Mercer Global Brief, every single day. Subscribe to this channel right now. Share this video with everyone you know who is desperately trying to understand not just the kinetic war, but what this war is doing to the very institution being asked to fight it. Join us live Monday through Friday. The mainstream coverage tells you what happened today. We tell you what it means for tomorrow. I will see you in the next one.